Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I rise in support of LR 6, and I appreciate Senator Ebke bringing this. I think Article 5 is one of the tools that we have in our toolbox as citizens and as states to help control and limit the power of the federal government. I'm not going to spend much time, if any, on the merits of trying to reduce our federal debt. I think that's been well stated by Senator Clements and others. But I do want to spend some time, I think, where I can add some value, which is on some of this discussion of a runaway convention, because that is one of the concerns that I've heard from constituents. Well, I heard it at the hearing, heard it on the floor this morning, and I've done a lot of research and had a lot of thought and spent a lot of time on this issue, and I do not think those concerns are with much merit, and I'll explain why. The Article 5 of the Constitution itself provides this very significant safeguard to an Article 5 convention, which is whatever comes out of that convention, and we can disagree as to whether the scope would be limited or if there would be a runaway convention and the rules would be altered. Whatever comes out of that convention has to and must be ratified by 38 states. And we've had a lot of discussion about the political discord we have in our country and how divided it is, and I would submit that in order to reach a threshold of 38, we would have to have something that had broad-based support and that would have support across ideological divides. Now, the counter to that is those that argue and say, well, the Article 5 convention requirement or the ratification requirement of 38 states really wouldn't apply. Now, of course, you'd have to ignore the text of the Constitution to get there. And the way that proponents of that argument do so is they say, well, the original convention was a quote-unquote a runaway convention, and they ignored what actually happened, and therefore that could happen again. And I think, colleagues, that is not accurate. And I'll give you three reasons why. The first reason is what I believe is a misstatement of the historical record, which is that the Congress called the initial Constitutional Convention only for the sole purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. If you believe that, and then we created a new, or the framers created a constitution, then it goes outside of the scope of what was initially called, therefore that's Exhibit A for what could happen today. That is not in line with the historical record. In fact, the Constitutional Convention was not called by Congress. It was called initially by the state of Virginia. And the purpose of that was after there was an Annapolis report that came out from a sort of a quasi-convention in Annapolis, and the proposal was to have a convention not to amend the Articles of Confederation, but instead to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Okay? That's an incredibly broad purpose. Virginia, the state of Virginia, called for a convention with that purpose in mind. State after state after state after state did the same thing. When it got to Congress, Congress did not call the convention. It didn't even recommend that a convention should be called. Instead, it expressed its opinion that this is a good thing to do. And I'll quote from a law review article that I was reading this weekend from the Florida Law Review, in which the author makes this exact point. I'm quoting, "It is perhaps truly extraordinary that so many writers have repeated the claim that Congress called the Constitutional Convention and legally limited its scope. First, the Confederation Congress had no power to issue a legally binding call. If the states decided to convene as a matter of law, they, and not Congress, fixed the scope of their delegates' authority. Second, the Articles gave Congress no power to limit that scope. To be sure, Congress, like any agent, could recommend to its principals, that is the states, a course of action outside of congressional authority, but this is not the same as legally restricting the scope of a convention." In other words, colleagues, the initial convention was called for a much broader purpose than to just amend the Articles of Confederation. That's point one. Point two, and this isn't a misinterpretation of the historical record, it's an omission of an important part of the historical record, which are the precise commission statements given to the delegates from each individual state that went to the convention. These are the statements, thank you, Mr. President, I'll probably have to come back on the mic to finish my remarks. But these commission statements are what bind the agents to their authority. It gave the delegates their authority to act or not act on behalf of their state. These are incredibly important to understanding the limits of the convention. And you don't have to just believe me, but this comes from James Madison in Federalist 40, in which he says, "The second point to be examined is whether the convention were authorized to frame and propose this mixed constitution. The powers of the convention ought, in strictness, to be determined by inspection of the commissions given to members by their respective constituents." These are incredibly important documents, and when you look at those documents, the vast majority, almost all, not all, but almost all the states provided their delegates authority with the broad powers that mirrored and matched the purpose of the convention. In other words, to bring the federal government in line with the needs of the nation at that time.
Time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks, Senator Hilgers.
Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.